Welcome to a new video. This video is a little bit of a change of pace from the rest of what's on this channel, and that's because I teach undergraduate students as well as PhD students, and this video is for my undergraduate class in economics of education. And I want to start this video by setting the stage for a really key policy debate in American education, and it started in the wake of the civil rights movement with a document called the Coleman Report in 1966. And the impetus for creating the Coleman Report was to document pervasive inequality in resources given to Black students versus white students. And this Coleman Report contained two main findings, one of which was not surprising and the other of which was. And the unsurprising finding is that, yes, indeed, Black students had fewer resources and went to schools that had fewer resources. And the second finding was surprising, and it said that once you account for family background and socioeconomic status, school resources explain very little of differences in academic achievement. So it seemed that variation in students' knowledge was driven by where they came from and not which school they attended. And the implication of these findings is that maybe pouring money into schools wouldn't level any differences in educational achievement. And in the 60 years since this report, there has been much debate about this in educational policy circles and academic research, but this finding has never fully gone away. And there was one influential researcher who was in graduate school at the time that the Coleman Report was released. He was attending MIT, and his name is Hanushek, or Rick Hanushek, and he has made several seminal contributions to the economics of education literature. One of the things that he's most well known for is his critique that spending more money on schools doesn't equate to better academic outcomes. And this is known as the Hanushek critique. In this video, I want to explore the ins and outs of this critique and see where it holds up and where it doesn't hold 60 years after the Coleman Report. And I'll explore 4 different ideas in this video, and hopefully throughout this video and from the information that I present, you'll be able to form your own conclusions about whether money matters for educational achievement. First, I'll show you some time series evidence that shows that educational achievement, as measured by NAEP test scores, has not risen alongside substantially higher spending on education in the US. But of course, we know that simple correlation may not imply causality, and so we'll look at some potential confounders for whether educational achievement has gotten more difficult to produce. We'll also make some international comparisons that seem to support the idea that maybe we're at the flat part of our production function as it relates to more and more investment. And then finally, we'll cover some cutting-edge quasi-experimental evidence that lends support to the idea that we need to continue investing in education if we want to produce greater amounts of educational achievement. Let's start with the basic facts. The chart you see on the screen is real per-pupil educational expenditure in the United States from the 1920s until the 2020s. And one thing to notice is that there seems to have been an inflection point around 1960 that coincides with the timing of the Coleman Report and the greater interest in school integration and providing equal investment to all students in the country. We now spend well over $15,000 per year per student in public K-12 education in the US, and that's more than triple the amount that was spent in the 1960s. You might be wondering where all the money went. This next chart shows that the average teacher salary has gone up slightly since the 1950s, but has mostly stayed the same in real terms over the last 30 years. If we aren't paying teachers more, are we hiring more teachers? And the answer to that is yes. This next chart shows a steady decline in the teacher-to-student ratio over time. And again, it's pretty flat over the last 30 years. So far, it seems that we've spent the extra money on more teachers, and we're not necessarily paying the teachers any better than we were before. This has resulted in smaller class sizes, but has it resulted in any better levels of educational achievement that we can measure. And for that, we can look at long-run test score trends from the NAEP or NAEP, which is a comparable assessment that's given to American students at different intervals during their educational career. And what you see here is that there's basically no stark trend in performance on the NAEP exam, at least in the reading section. And while the math scores do seem to have shown an increase through 2010, it's certainly not as large of an increase as the spending increase. The math scores have not tripled in step with the tripling of the spending amounts. These pictures form the basis of the Hanushek critique, but in his academic research, he looked beyond simple time series correlations. He did what's called a meta-analysis and looked at every study in the literature that was published that looked at the effect of increasing spending or increasing the student-teacher ratio or increasing teacher salaries. And the main result is that most of the studies that look at this report statistically insignificant estimates, and some even report significantly negative, and some report significantly positive. And while the lion's share of the statistically significant ones skew towards the positive, the overwhelming majority are statistically insignificant. The implication of this is that maybe we are spending too much money on education, and that if we cut spending in half, we could still have the same levels of achievement as before. You can see how research such as this might ruffle some feathers. Then a common critique would be, well, this is just lumping together a lot of different compositional differences. And so maybe if we look at state-level spending and state-level NAEP scores, there might be some relationship. And if we do that, we see that there is a slight positive coefficient on this regression line, but the slope is basically indistinguishable from zero. And why is that? Well, you have states like New York that spend a lot, but have lower NAEP scores than states like Utah that spend very little and have slightly higher NAEP scores. And what happens if we account for other characteristics of the states, include state fixed effects? Well, we get something that's a very similar picture, even after residualizing by a lot of factors that would potentially be confounders here. And we can also see that the state-level cross-sectional relationship has held over time. If you compare the year 2000 versus the year 2019, the relationship is basically the same. We've just shifted the x-axis over to the right as we've spent more in every single state. And yes, the NAEP scores have gone up slightly, but the key result still holds. You might also be wondering if this spending versus achievement correlation holds internationally. And the answer is that it does. If you look at OECD countries, you see a very similar flat-sloped line if you map spending per pupil against an internationally comparable test score known as the PISA. Interestingly, the US spends the fourth most per pupil on education in the OECD, but scores close to the bottom on the PISA exam. So what's going on here? We should expect that spending more on education should lead to better academic outcomes. Is it really true that inputs and outputs are only very weakly linked? Three mechanisms have been proposed to explain why there is a weak link between inputs and outputs. First is diminishing returns. What you see on this conceptual chart is that there might be a certain threshold after which investing more money will result in very little additional achievement. Whereas if you are below the threshold, then spending really improves achievement steeply. So the US might be in a range where spending additional money won't really get any additional achievement gains. Aside from diminishing returns, what else can explain this weak relationship between inputs and outputs? Another hypothesis set forth is political distortions, which is just the idea that there may be political goals of school boards or state governments that end up diverting resources away from the parts of the process that result in higher achievement in terms of test scores. And then finally, there's also an argument in terms of lack of efficiency that arises from lack of competition. In many locations in the US, the public school system is the only game in town. And so they may be using their resources inefficiently, and that's what's happening to the money and why it's not converting into greater test scores. But before we conclude that we should cut spending, we should also consider if the job of education, of teaching young students, has gotten harder over this time period. Imagine if we compared the world record mile run time, and in the past it was on a flat track, but in the present we're doing the trials on a steep slope. We wouldn't expect the fastest time to go up over time, even if athletes were getting better, because they're having to run uphill now, whereas in the past they were on a flat surface. That's the type of argument that I'm going to make now. And the key confounders in this vein are things that Hanushek calls exogenous cost shifters. These are things like the percent of students who require special education services, or secular changes to the household composition, or changes to family structure that have made it harder to parent and resulted in less support at home, which could shift educational duties even further onto the school, whereas in the past that might have been a job that the parents took care of. And another contributing factor along this vein could be English as a second language students. We know that immigration has gone up quite a bit in the US since the 1960s, and as additional non-native speaking students have entered the school system, that could put downward pressure on the measured academic achievement and also cause more services to have to be produced to meet the needs of these students. So what does the data say here? If we look at the percent of students who are on an individualized educational plan, or IEP, the rate of these students, or the proportion of these students, has basically doubled since 1975. So over a 50-year period, there are now twice as many students on IEPs as there used to be, with particular growth over the last 15 years. And the data suggests that this is driven by autism and ADHD prevalence growing over this time period. And whether you believe that autism and ADHD have inherently grown, or whether this is an artifact of different diagnosis thresholds, I'll leave that topic for another day. The fact of the matter is that greater number of students on IEPs will result in greater costs of providing the education. And if we look at single parent households, the share of children living in a household with a single parent has basically doubled between the 1970s and 2000, but has stayed pretty flat thereafter. And so you could maybe tell a story that there were kind of two waves of cost shocks, one from changing household structure, and then another from greater amounts of special ed students. And what's been happening to students who speak a different language at home than English? There's not as much of a stark picture here. The rate has basically been the same over the period that it's been tracked by the federal government. Now let's look at some more recent studies that somewhat complicate the picture that we've painted so far. The earliest study comes from a 1992 paper by David Card and Alan Kruger, and they looked at long-run outcomes rather than just test scores, and they showed that Black men's earnings converged to white men's to a greater degree 20 years after finishing schooling. And they looked at the central question of the Hanushek critique from a slightly different angle. Instead of looking at test scores of the outcome, they looked at Black-white earnings differences as adults. And instead of looking at spending, they looked at student-to-teacher ratios for Blacks versus whites. And what they showed is that states that had less of a gap in student-teacher ratios between Blacks and whites in the early 1900s ended up having smaller wage differences between Blacks and whites later on in the 1900s. More recently, there's been 3 different papers written by researcher Kirabo Jackson, and the most prominent paper, published in 2016 in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, looks at the link between exogenous changes in school financing that were done in response to court decisions and how those changes in spending correlated with later life outcomes, in particular years of education completed, adult wages, and poverty incidence as an adult. And they found evidence that all 3 of these are affected by the exogenous shift in spending. in ways that are consistent with inputs mattering for outputs. And they also showed that these responses, or the relationship between inputs and outputs, is stronger for students coming from more disadvantaged backgrounds. So the main story I take from this paper is that we need to be looking at different outcomes than standardized test scores, and that there is treatment effect heterogeneity based on the socioeconomic status of the student. Another paper by Jackson and his co-authors takes the contrapositive approach to the Hanushek critique. What I mean by that is, if we think that school spending should equate to higher test scores, if we take away the school spending, will that result in lower test scores? And if that's true, then that's actually support for a positive link between spending and outcomes. So this paper looks at exogenous spending cuts that came about because of the Great Recession, and it basically finds that students who were exposed to spending cuts had lower test scores and lower college-going rates later on, and that the gap in test scores between students of different races widened as a result of this, as a nod to the Card and Kruger results on racial convergence. And then a final paper looks at what we should expect to see in terms of greater spending and outcomes that we're interested in. I view this paper as an update to Hanushek's 2003 paper, in that it does a meta-analysis and focuses on studies that are leveraging quasi-experimental variation. And the end result is that additional spending does improve test scores. And what they estimate is that on average, spending an additional $1,000 will result in about 3.2% of a standard deviation higher of test scores, and an increase in college attendance by about 3 percentage points. And consistent with earlier evidence, the effect of spending on test scores or other outcomes is smaller in groups that are more advantaged. And they also look at whether the spending is spent on capital improvements, like improving the school building or the school grounds, versus personnel spending. And they find that the effects are pretty equal between those two forms of spending. So where does this leave us after we've gone through a bunch of different data sources and looked at different perspectives? There does seem to be an empirical regularity that Hanushek pointed out, that the more we spend, the aggregate test scores are still going to be pretty flat. I would argue that these exogenous cost shifters, in the form of special education demand or changes in the composition of households, have had a non-trivial impact to undermine work that used to be done in the home that now needs to be shifted into the school. And according to the evidence that we've reviewed here, it's clearly the case that we should be thinking about outcomes different than standardized test scores, and in particular that students from disadvantaged backgrounds seem to benefit more from increased spending than students from advantaged backgrounds. The takeaway for me is not that we should be spending more or spending less, but that we should be spending smarter. And we certainly live in a data-rich day and age where we should be able to do a better job of doing that. Thanks for watching this video. I hope that you learned a few things and found it interesting, and I hope to see you around in another video. Thanks.